In 1960, Chevrolet built the only rear-engined, air-cooled car ever mass-produced in America. It won Motor Trend's Car of the Year. It inspired the Ford Mustang. And then a 31-year-old lawyer wrote a book. General Motors hired private detectives and prostitutes to destroy him, and the whole thing went sideways. This is the Corvair. To understand the Corvair, you have to understand the man who willed it into existence. Ed Cole was not a normal car executive. He was an engineer who happened to run things. By 1952, he was chief engineer at Chevrolet. By 1956, he was general manager of the entire division. Along the way, he fathered the small block Chevy V8, arguably the most important engine in American automotive history. The man had credibility, and he had a problem. By the late 50s, imported cars were eating into American sales. The Volkswagen Beetle, that funny little rear-engine thing from Germany, was moving over 150,000 units a year in the States by 1958. Renault had a foothold with the Dauphine. Even the tiny Fiat 600 was showing up in American driveways. Meanwhile, American Motors' Rambler and Studebaker's Lark were proving that domestic buyers, hit hard by a nasty recession, were actually willing to buy small. Detroit's Big Three had spent the entire decade selling land yachts with chrome-plated tail fins and 300-horsepower V8s. The smallest thing in Chevrolet's lineup weighed well over 3,000 pounds. Something had to change. Ford and Chrysler responded the obvious way. The Falcon and the Valiant were just shrunken versions of normal American cars. Front engine, rear drive, nothing exotic, scaled-down bodies on conventional platforms with 4-cylinder or 6-cylinder engines, safe, predictable, easy to build on existing tooling. Ed Cole looked at those plans and basically said no. He wanted something completely different. He wanted an air-cooled flat six in the rear, independent suspension on all four corners, aluminum construction, and unibody design. In 1956, that was borderline insane for a mass-market American car. Cole didn't care. He had been fascinated with rear engines since the early 40s when he worked on an experimental rear-engined Cadillac. He had spent time around air-cooled flat six engines in military tanks. He was a pilot who logged 300 hours behind a Continental flat six in a Beechcraft Bonanza. The man just liked flat sixes. But here's the thing. Cole knew the project would face internal resistance. General Motors was not in the business of building weird cars. So he did what any reasonable executive would do. He lied about it. Cole disguised the entire Corvair program as a development project for Holden, GM's Australian subsidiary. He used Holden stationery. He assigned Holden part numbers to every component. He had the styling work done in the International studio instead of the Chevrolet studio. When the first prototype needed road testing, they bolted a Corvair engine into a Porsche 356 and stuck Holden badges on the test mules. Ed Cole was running a covert operation inside his own company. The deception worked. Cole got approval from GM's executive committee in the spring of 1957, right as GM's 58 models were bombing in showrooms. The timing helped. With sales cratering, the argument for a small, economical car was hard to dismiss, but the real engineering challenge was just beginning. The engine was the heart of the problem. Cole and his team, including engineers Al Colby and Robert Benzinger, decided water cooling was impractical for a rear-mounted setup. The plumbing would be too complex, the weight too high. So air cooling it was, but air cooling a six-cylinder engine making 80 horsepower is not like air cooling a VW4 making 36. The Corvair's flat six had 140 cubic inches of displacement, 6 separate cast-iron cylinder barrels, and an aluminum crankcase. It was a complicated engine, and it came in heavy, 78 pounds over the target weight. That doesn't sound like much until you remember that all 78 extra pounds were hanging behind the rear axle. in a car where weight distribution was already the critical engineering variable. They also had a problem nobody talks about enough. Chevrolet had almost no experience with aluminum engines. They had to bring in a German firm, Carl Schmidt, to help develop the casting procedures. The engine required a pressurized cooling fan, individual cylinder barrels, and a lubrication system designed from scratch. Every Turbo Air 6 was essentially hand-engineered compared to the simple cast-iron V8s rolling off Chevy's other assembly lines, which meant it cost more to build, a lot more. The Corvair was supposed to be an economy car. It was becoming anything but economical to manufacture. Then there was the suspension. The rear engine meant a conventional live rear axle was out. Cole's team went with swing axle independent rear suspension, similar to the Volkswagen and various European cars. The thing about swing axles is they work fine under normal driving. But push them hard in a corner and the outside rear wheel can do something called tuck under. The half shaft drops below its pivot point and acts as a lever, forcing the rear of the car upward. The tire rolls onto its sidewall. Grip vanishes. The car oversteers violently, and suddenly you're facing a direction you did not intend. Now, GM's engineers knew about this. Maurice Olley, Chevrolet's own research director, had written a technical paper in 1953 specifically warning that rear-engined cars with swing axle suspension were, and I'm paraphrasing here, a poor bargain that couldn't handle safely in a crosswind. Olley literally worked for Cole. Cole knew. They all knew. The original plan included a front anti-roll bar that would have reduced the oversteer tendency. It wasn't a complete fix for the tuck-under problem, but it would have helped. Late in development, facing cost overruns on an already expensive car, someone decided to cut the anti-roll bar to save a few dollars per unit. The car was supposed to retail around $2,000. Every penny mattered, so the anti-roll bar became an option, an unadvertised option at that. Number 696 on the order sheet, if your dealer even knew it existed. To compensate for the missing sway bar, Chevrolet specified unusual tire pressures. 15 psi in the front, 26 in the rear. That's an 11-pound differential. Every other car on the road ran roughly equal pressure front to rear. If you inflated a Corvair's tires normally, which gas station attendants did constantly because they didn't know any better, you got a car that oversteered like a shopping cart on ice. The tire pressure spec wasn't even on the glove box sticker in early models. It was buried in the owner's manual that nobody read. The Corvair launched on October 1st, 1959, and something unexpected happened. It didn't sell the way anyone predicted. The base models, stripped to the bone with bench seats and manual everything, sat on lots. They were competing against the Ford Falcon, which was simpler, cheaper, and far easier for any mechanic in America to understand. First-year sales were decent, but not dominant. The Falcon outsold it handily. As a VW fighter, the Corvair was a qualified disappointment. But the Monza changed everything. In the spring of 1960, Chevrolet put together a show car version of the Corvair with bucket seats, a floor-mounted 4-speed shifter, deep twist carpeting, and sporty trim. It was supposed to be a circuit display piece, something to generate buzz at auto shows. Instead, people fell over themselves trying to buy it. Chevrolet rushed the Monza into production, and suddenly the Corvair wasn't an economy car anymore. It was a sporty compact, something America had never really seen before. Not a sports car, exactly, not an economy car. Something in between. By 1961, the Monza was outselling every other Corvair model combined. 80% of all Corvairs sold were Monzas. College kids loved them. Young professionals loved them. For about $2,300, you got a car that looked European, drove completely different from anything else on the road, sounded like nothing else in a parking lot, and turned heads at the drive-in. It had a flat floor because there was no transmission tunnel. It had lighter steering than anything in its class because the engine wasn't sitting on the front wheels. And it had a personality that no Falcon or Valiant could touch. Nothing else in America was remotely like it. The lineup expanded in '61, station wagons called Lakewoods. The Corvair 95 series brought forward control vans called Greenbriers and Corvins, plus the ramp-side pickup, which had a hinged side panel that folded down into a loading ramp. All of them powered by that same rear-mounted flat six. It was as if Chevrolet had discovered a Swiss Army knife and kept unfolding new blades. In 1962, Chevrolet leaned harder into the sporty image and introduced the Spyder package. This added a turbocharger to the flat six, making the Corvair just the second turbocharged production car in American history, right behind the Oldsmobile Jetfire by about a month. The turbo bumped output from 80 or 95 horsepower to 150. The Spyder came mandatory with a 4-speed manual, full instrumentation including a tachometer and boost gauge, and enough personality to make Porsche owners nervous. A Spyder coupe listed for less than $2,700. A Porsche 356 Super 90 with similar power cost nearly 50% more. That math mattered. 1962 was peak Corvair. Almost 330,000 units sold across a dozen models, including coupes, sedans, convertibles, station wagons, vans, and pickup trucks. The lineup was absurd. But a problem was forming on the horizon, and it wasn't named Ralph Nader. It was named Lee Iacocca. Over at Ford, Iacocca had been watching the Monza sell like mad, and he saw a market that the Monza was barely tapping. Young buyers wanted sporty, they wanted affordable, and they wanted something that looked fast, even if it wasn't. In his own autobiography, Iacocca flat out admitted that the Corvair Monza was the direct inspiration for the Ford Mustang. General Motors had accidentally invented a market segment. Ford was about to own it. The Mustang launched on April 17, 1964, and it wasn't just a hit. It was a cultural earthquake. Ford sold 22,000 on the first day, over 400,000 by the end of the calendar year, 559,000 in the first full model year. Lee Iacocca was on the cover of both Time and Newsweek in the same week. The genius of the Mustang was its simplicity. A Falcon chassis underneath, a pretty body on top, a long list of options that let every buyer feel like they were getting something custom. Front engine, V8 available, conventional in every way that mattered. It was everything the Corvair wasn't. Easy to understand, easy for any dealer mechanic to service. Cheap to build because it shared components with Ford's existing lineup. And it had a hood long enough to land a small aircraft on, which Americans apparently found irresistible. The Corvair was technically superior in many ways, better suspension, more sophisticated engineering throughout. But Americans weren't buying engineering sophistication, they were buying image. And the Mustang's image was perfect. Long hood, short deck. The suggestion of power even in six-cylinder form. The Corvair asked buyers to understand it. The Mustang just asked them to want it. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. Okay, back to it. Now let's talk about what the Corvair actually was, mechanically, because the engineering deserves better than a footnote about handling problems. The Turbo Air 6 was unlike anything else in American production. A horizontally opposed flat six, air-cooled, with an aluminum crankcase and heads and cast-iron cylinder barrels. Each cylinder was individually cast and bolted to the crankcase. The whole engine weighed about 366 pounds. For reference, a contemporary Chevy small block V8 weighed over 500. The weight savings were real. Cooling was handled by a belt-driven blower that forced air across the cylinders through a system of sheet metal shrouding. The engine sat in an enclosed compartment, and those slots on the rear deck lid that looked decorative were actually functional air intakes. Their placement was dictated by styling rather than engineering, which is a very GM sentence, but they worked well enough by happy accident. The base engine in 1960 made 80 horsepower from 140 cubic inches. Not exciting, but adequate for a 2,400-pound car. The optional Super Turbo Air made 95. By 64, displacement grew to 164 cubic inches through a stroke increase, and the base jumped to 95 horsepower. But the real party trick was the turbocharged Spyder engine. The turbo unit was built by Thompson Valve Division of Thomson Ramo Wooldridge. It fed a Carter YH side draft carburetor, the same one used on early Corvettes. The internals were beefed up considerably: heavy-duty rod and main bearings, chromed piston rings, nickel-chromium alloy exhaust valves, a forged chrome-steel crankshaft replacing the standard cast unit. At 150 horsepower, the Spyder engine was making nearly twice the output of the base motor from the same basic architecture. For the second generation in 65, the turbo was bumped to 180 horsepower and 265 pound-feet of torque. The non-turbo Corsa got 140 horses through 4 single-barrel carburetors, larger valves, and a dual exhaust. 4 individual carburetors on an economy car. The cost accountants must have been physically ill. The second-generation Corvair, starting in 65, was a genuinely different car underneath. The rear suspension was completely redesigned. Gone were the swing axles. In their place, a fully independent setup closely modeled on the contemporary Corvette Stingray. Fully articulated half axles maintained constant tire camber in all driving situations. The rear roll center dropped to half its previous height. Coil springs replaced the old combination of coils and swing arms. U-joints at both ends of each half shaft allowed the wheels to move through their full travel without the jacking effect that had plagued the first generation. It was, by every objective measure, a properly engineered rear suspension, the kind of suspension that Porsche wouldn't adopt on the 911 until years later. The brakes were larger now too, borrowed from the Chevelle. The differential got a stronger ring gear. An alternator replaced the old generator. The heater system was significantly improved, addressing one of the original car's most common complaints. You could even get in-dash air conditioning, a telescoping steering column, and an AM/FM stereo radio. By 65, the Corvair was not just competent. It was genuinely good. Car and driver called the 65 Corvair the most beautiful car to appear in America since before World War II. The styling, under Bill Mitchell's direction, was a masterclass in restraint. Pillarless, hardtop design. Coke bottle fenders, no grille up front because there was no radiator. The rear tapered into recessed taillights that echoed the Monza GT show car. It looked European without trying to look European. At around $2,100 for a base model, you were getting Corvette-derived suspension and genuinely sophisticated engineering for the price of a Ford Falcon. The problem was that almost nobody cared. By the time the beautiful 65 arrived, the Mustang had already stolen the market. Corvair sales for 65 came in at about 237,000, respectable. But the Mustang did 559,000 the same year. And within GM, the decision had already been made. In April 1965, 7 months before Ralph Nader's book was even published, GM issued an internal memo freezing all further development of the Corvair. No more engineering improvements beyond what was needed to meet regulations. The reasoning was straightforward. The Corvair was expensive to build. It shared no major components with any other Chevrolet. Its air-cooled engine reportedly cost more to manufacture than any engine in the Chevy lineup except the limited production aluminum block 427 V8, and it was losing to the Mustang. GM wanted a conventional Mustang fighter built on the Nova platform, sharing engines and transmissions with the rest of the lineup. That car became the Camaro, codenamed Panther, designated XP836, and approved in August '64. The Corvair was dead before Nader typed his first sentence. Then Nader typed his sentences anyway. Unsafe at Any Speed was published in November 1965. The first chapter was titled The Sporty Corvair, the One-Car Accident. Nader's argument focused on the 1960 through 63 models and their swing axle handling characteristics. He described the tuck-under phenomenon, the deleted anti-roll bar, the unusual tire pressure requirements, and cases of single-vehicle accidents where Corvairs lost control and rolled. He was specifically critical of GM's decision to cut the stabilizer bar for cost reasons when engineers knew the car had handling limitations. The book initially got modest attention. A New York Times article on publication day, a rebuttal from industry executives the next day, and then, mostly, silence. It might have faded into obscurity, but General Motors, in what may be the most spectacular own goal in corporate history, decided to investigate Ralph Nader. Not the claims in his book, Nader himself. They hired private detectives to dig into his personal life. They tapped his phone. They questioned his friends about his sexual habits. According to multiple accounts, they sent women to try to lure him into compromising situations. They followed him. They made harassing phone calls. The largest corporation in the world went after a 31-year-old lawyer like he was a Cold War spy. It backfired spectacularly. Nader found out about the surveillance and reported it to Senator Abraham Ribicoff, who was chairing hearings on auto safety. In March 1966, GM's CEO James Roush was hauled before the Senate. Senator Robert Kennedy grilled him. Roush apologized publicly. The hearing was carried live on television. 6 hours of a corporate titan squirming in front of senators made Ralph Nader a household name overnight and turned Unsafe at Any Speed into a bestseller. GM eventually settled Nader's harassment lawsuit for $425,000. Nader used the money to fund consumer advocacy work. He told reporters that GM was, quote, financing their own ombudsman. The fallout was devastating for the Corvair specifically, and GM generally. The National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act passed in 1966, creating federal safety standards for the first time. Every car in America would now need to meet regulations that didn't exist before a young lawyer wrote a book and a corporation tried to destroy him. Corvair sales collapsed from 237,000 in '65 to just over 100,000 in '66, down to 27,000 in '67. The Camaro arrived that year, and whatever oxygen remained in the room for a Chevrolet sporty car was immediately consumed. By '68, barely 14,000 Corvairs sold. The advertising budget was zeroed out. The model lineup shrank to 2 coupes and a convertible. Dealers didn't want to stock them. Mechanics didn't want to work on them. The car that had once accounted for nearly 1/3 annual sales was being treated like an embarrassment. The final year, 1969, saw just 6,000 cars built at the Willow Run plant. Some people theorized that was roughly 1 per Chevrolet dealership, giving each dealer one last Corvair to sell. More likely, Chevrolet just didn't want unsold inventory when the line shut down. The last Corvair rolled off the Willow Run assembly line in Ypsilanti, Michigan on May 14, 1969. It was a gold 2-door hardtop, the 1,786,243rd Corvair ever built. The workers signed it. Then they went home. Here's the cruel irony. In 1972, 3 years after the last Corvair was built, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration published the results of comparative handling tests conducted in '71. They tested a '63 Corvair against a Ford Falcon, Plymouth Valiant, Volkswagen Beetle, and Renault Dauphine, along with a '67 Corvair for reference. The testing was extensive. slalom courses, emergency lane changes, circular tracks at increasing speeds. The works. The conclusion, published in a 143-page report, was that the 1960 through 63 Corvair did not have an abnormal potential for loss of control or rollover and performed at least as well as some of the competing vehicles in both foreign and domestic categories. An independent panel of 3 professional engineers selected by the National Academy of Sciences reviewed the study's methodology and upheld the findings. The Beetle, incidentally, showed similar handling characteristics to the early Corvair. Nobody wrote a bestseller about that. Nader called the NHTSA report a whitewash and demanded a congressional investigation. GM said it confirmed what they had always maintained. The Corvair was already 3 years dead, so the vindication was purely academic. But it matters to the people who love the car. Of the roughly 150 lawsuits filed against GM over the Corvair, the company won nearly all of them that actually went to trial, and there were other consequences nobody predicted. The Corvair Monza had created the sporty compact segment. The Mustang exploited it. The Camaro followed. Within a decade, the pony car market that the Corvair invented was dominated by big engines and heavy cars that had nothing to do with the nimble, European-flavored machine that started it all. The category the Corvair created ended up being defined by everything the Corvair wasn't. Ed Cole, for his part, was never punished. He was promoted to president of General Motors in October 1967. He oversaw the development of the Chevrolet Vega, which had its own spectacular engine problems. He retired in '74 and died in a plane crash in 1977. Cole reportedly lamented in his later years that if the Corvair had still been in production during the 1973 oil crisis, Chevrolet could have sold everyone it could build. He was probably right. Chevrolet had even planned a third-generation Corvair for 1970, essentially a reskin that resembled the '73 Pontiac Grand Am. It got as far as full-scale clay models before being killed in early '68. The turbo-hydromatic 350 transmission had already been configured for it. All that work, abandoned. Today, about 1.8 million Corvairs were built over 10 years. Thousands survive. They're maintained by a dedicated community through the Corvair Society of America, which has chapters across the country and holds national conventions drawing hundreds of cars. A network of independent parts suppliers keeps these cars on the road, and surprisingly, most parts remain available. These people are not casual hobbyists. They are believers. Prices are rising, but still reasonable. You can buy a decent Monza coupe for under $20,000. A Spyder or Corsa convertible will cost more, but nothing close to what comparable Porsches from the same era command. A good '66 Yenko Stinger, the hot rod version built by a Pennsylvania Chevy dealer named Don Yenko, who won a national championship racing modified Corvairs, can bring $80,000 or more. But those are rare. The Corvair also left its mark on design in ways most people don't realize. That high belt line wrapping around the body became known as the Corvair line. BMW adopted it. Fiat adopted it. The styling influence traveled across the Atlantic and showed up on European cars throughout the '60s. The Corvair represents something that doesn't really happen anymore in the American car industry. A major manufacturer took a genuine engineering risk on a mass-market product. Air-cooled flat six, rear engine, aluminum construction, independent suspension, turbocharging in 1960 from Chevrolet, the same company that sold more Impalas than most countries have cars. It was bold. It was flawed. It was ahead of its time in ways that got overshadowed by the controversy that followed. The second-generation Corvair was, by most accounts, one of the best handling American cars of the '60s. It just had the wrong name attached to the wrong headlines. The Corvair didn't die because it was dangerous. It didn't die because of Ralph Nader. Not really. It died because it was too different, too expensive to build, And too late to the fight it accidentally started. The Mustang killed the Corvair. Nader just showed up at the funeral and made it famous. And there you have it, the Corvair, the car that created the pony car market and then got buried by it. If you've owned one, or your dad did, or you've got a story, drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We do this every week.